Somewhere in the northeastern mountains of Japan, carved into the edge of a landscape the imperial court once called the end of civilization, there are place names that do not come from Japanese. They come from a language that was never supposed to have mattered. The language of a people the official chronicles recorded as barbarians, as savages, as enemies to be subdued and forgotten. People the textbooks have spent over 1,000 years calling vanished. For 12 centuries, the story of who the Japanese people are has had 2 chapters. The ancient Jomon, hunters and gatherers who lived on the archipelago for 15,000 years before anyone else arrived. And the Yayoi, migrants from the East Asian mainland who brought rice, farming, bronze, and the foundations of what would become Japanese civilization. 2 peoples, 2 migrations. A clean, legible origin story that fit neatly into the national identity Japan has been constructing since the imperial court first put brush to paper in the 8th century. Then, the genomes of more than 3,000 living Japanese people were sequenced and compared against 12 newly extracted ancient DNA samples from burial sites across the archipelago. And when the results came back from the RIKEN Center for Integrative Medical Sciences, the clean 2-chapter story did not survive contact with the data. There was a 3rd ancestral group, a population that the dual origins model had no place for, pointing in a direction nobody had expected, leaving a genetic signature that was strongest precisely in the region where the official chronicles recorded the most sustained and violent campaign of suppression in early Japanese history. The textbooks will tell you the Emishi were Eastern barbarians, primitive tribes, people who resisted civilization and were rightfully absorbed into it. The word the Yamato court used for them translates, in its kanji, to something between shrimp and savage, a deliberate dehumanization written into the name itself. The genome has a different translation. It says they were never absorbed. It says their blood was never erased. And it says that the people the imperial court spent 2 centuries trying to eliminate are still here, still walking the same northeastern valleys, still carrying in their DNA the record of everything the official history tried to make disappear. The disappearance never happened, and the evidence that proves it has been sitting inside the bodies of 125 million living people the entire time. To understand what the DNA is overturning, you have to first understand the story it is overturning. And that means going back to the origin narrative that Japan has been telling about itself since the very first moment it decided to write history down. The Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, the 2 oldest surviving chronicles of Japan, were both compiled in the early 8th century, around 712 and 720 AD respectively, on the direct orders of the imperial court. They were not neutral documents. They were political instruments, written at a moment when the Yamato state was in the process of consolidating control over the Japanese archipelago, and needed a history that justified that consolidation. They provided one. The chronicles traced the imperial lineage back to the sun goddess Amaterasu, established the divine right of the Yamato rulers to govern the islands, and described everyone who did not accept that governance as barbarians outside the civilized order. The people the chronicles called Emishi were at the center of that framing. They lived in the northeast, in the region the court called the eastern frontier, a vast territory stretching across what is now the Tohoku region of Honshu. The chronicles describe them in language calibrated to establish their otherness. Hairy people, people who tied arrows in their topknots, people who drank blood, lived in holes in winter and nests in summer, and had no distinction between father and child. The descriptions were not ethnographic, they were verdicts. But even through the hostility of the Yamato framing, certain facts about the Emishi could not be entirely obscured. They were not disorganized. They had chiefs, alliances, and a diplomatic relationship with the court that oscillated between tribute, negotiation, and open warfare across more than 2 centuries. They were skilled horsemen at a time when the Yamato imperial army mostly relied on heavy infantry. They had developed a style of warfare built around mounted archery and hit-and-run tactics that the Japanese imperial forces found extremely difficult to counter. The court's first military expeditions against the Emishi, launched in the late 7th century, failed. The second round of campaigns in the early 8th century also struggled. It was not until 801 AD, under the general Sakanue no Tamuramaro, that the imperial forces achieved something approaching a decisive military result against the Emishi heartland. Even then, the story of what followed is instructive. Tamuramaro captured the Emishi leaders Atarui and Morai, along with more than 500 warriors in 802. He brought them to the capital. And then, despite his own recorded plea that their lives should be spared, the court had them executed. In Kawachi province, far from their homeland, far from any possibility of inspiring further resistance. The execution was political. The court needed the Emishi story to end, and it needed to end completely. What the court could not execute was the population. The hundreds of thousands of people who had lived in the northeastern valleys for generations before the Yamato state existed, who had farmed and hunted and built communities in that landscape for far longer than the imperial chronicles were willing to acknowledge, did not disappear because a general won a campaign. They were reclassified. The hostile Emishi became the Fushu, the subjugated, and then, over generations, they became simply Japanese. The category was abolished by administrative decision. The people remained. This is the history that the genome is now reading in reverse, starting from the bodies of living people and tracing backward through the centuries to a population that the official record tried to write out of existence. The scientific method that made this possible is worth understanding, because it is what separates this from speculation, and it is also the reason the result is so difficult to dismiss. The RIKEN study, published in Science Advances in May 2026, sequenced complete genomes from 3,256 living Japanese individuals drawn from 7 geographic regions, stretching from Hokkaido in the far north to Okinawa in the far south. Not partial sequences, not the targeted genetic panels used in earlier population studies. Full whole genome sequences, which give researchers a vastly richer picture of ancestry, admixture, and population history than previous methods allowed. The researchers were looking, in part, to test the tripartite origins theory that had been proposed on the basis of more limited ancient DNA evidence in 2021. That theory had suggested that modern Japanese people might carry genetic contributions from 3 distinct ancestral populations rather than 2. The new study, with its dramatically larger data set and higher resolution sequencing, confirmed it. The 3 components were the Jomon, the Yayoi, and a third signal that previous research had not fully characterized. The Jomon contribution was strongest in Okinawa, where it accounted for roughly 28% of ancestry. The Yayoi and subsequent continental East Asian contribution was strongest in Western Japan, consistent with the known pattern of migration from the mainland. And the third component showed a completely different geographic distribution. It was concentrated in northeastern Japan, in the Tohoku region, in precisely the territory where the Emishi had lived. This geographic specificity matters enormously. A genetic signal that appeared uniformly distributed across Japan might indicate a widespread ancient mixing event or founding population effect that predated the historical period. A signal concentrated in the northeast, strongest exactly where one specific historically documented population lived, and weakest in the regions the Yamato court controlled earliest and most thoroughly, is not a statistical artifact. It is a fingerprint. The ancestry the researchers identified in northeastern Japan linked to populations from northeastern Asia, distinct from both the Jomon and the Yayoi, and consistent with the geographic origin of the groups the chronicles described as the Emishi's northeastern neighbors and probable kin. When the researchers compared the ancient DNA samples from individuals excavated at Emishi period sites in the Tohoku region against the modern genomic data, the continuity was clear. The signal in living people traced back through the ancient individuals. The Emishi are in that data. Their genetic contribution to the modern Japanese population is measurable, geographically coherent, and statistically robust. 12 centuries after the imperial court tried to write them out of history, the genome is writing them back in. The finding about Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA adds another layer to the story, and it is one that connects Japan's ancient history to something far older and far stranger than the medieval frontier wars. Every person alive on Earth today who is not of sub-Saharan African ancestry carries a small amount of Neanderthal DNA. This is the legacy of an interbreeding event, or several events, that occurred when modern humans first moved out of Africa and into Eurasia, where they encountered the Neanderthals who had been living there for hundreds of thousands of years. The percentage is small, typically between 1% and 2%, but the genes themselves are not biologically inert. Specific Neanderthal-derived sequences have been associated with immune function, skin pigmentation, and, in one striking case, an elevated risk of severe complications from COVID-19. The Denisovans are less well known, in part because their physical remains consist of a handful of bone fragments and teeth from a single cave in Siberia. But their genetic legacy is real and substantial. Modern Tibetans carry a Denisovan-derived version of the EPAS1 gene that helps them survive at high altitudes. People from Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australians carry the highest levels of Denisovan ancestry among any living population, around 4 to 6%. The Denisovans were a widespread and genetically diverse archaic human group, and their DNA reached the ancestors of multiple modern populations through interbreeding events that occurred tens of thousands of years ago. What the RIKEN study found, and what earlier work published in October 2025 in Current Biology had already hinted at, was that the distribution of Denisovan DNA within Japan tells its own story of population replacement and survival. The ancient Jomon, Japan's indigenous people, had carried almost no Denisovan ancestry. This was a surprising finding. Most East Asian populations carry low but measurable levels of Denisovan DNA, as do the populations of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The Jomon had the lowest Denisovan ancestry of any ancient East Asian population tested. Their genetic profile suggested a lineage that had been largely isolated on the Japanese archipelago for thousands of years, accumulating its own distinct genetic identity without the admixture events that shaped mainland populations. Then the Kofun period arrived, roughly 300 to 710 AD, and everything changed. The ancient DNA from Kofun period burial sites showed a dramatic increase in both continental East Asian ancestry and Denisovan-derived sequences. The migration waves that brought the centralized state system, Chinese-style writing, and the political culture that would crystallize into the Yamato court also brought a new genetic profile that progressively diluted the older Jomon signal across most of the archipelago. Except in the northeast, where the Jomon component remained stronger, where the Emishi resisted, where the third ancestral signal would eventually register most clearly in the modern genomic data. The distribution of ancient DNA across Japan is not just a story of migration and admixture. It is a map of resistance. The regions where the Yamato court reached earliest and consolidated most completely show the strongest replacement of Jomon ancestry by continental East Asian signatures. The regions where the Emishi held out longest show the most persistent traces of the older genomic profile. The war on the frontier was also, in a way that neither side could have known, a war over genetic continuity. And the genome shows who kept more of what they started with. The question that follows is the one the official history has the most stake in answering, and the one the genomic data is least willing to cooperate with. If the Emishi were never truly eliminated, if their genetic contribution survived into the modern population, what exactly were the Yamato chronicles writing about when they described their suppression? The answer that the combined evidence of genetics, archaeology, and the chronicles themselves begins to suggest is both more complicated and more disturbing than the clean narrative of conquest and assimilation. The Emishi resistance was not a disorganized frontier skirmish. It was a sustained two-century military campaign that the most powerful state in East Asia found extremely difficult to prosecute. The imperial court launched formal military expeditions against the Emishi in the late 7th century, in the early 8th century, in the mid-8th century, and again in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. Each campaign required enormous mobilization of resources, conscripted labor, and military logistics that strained the capacity of the Nara and early Heian state. Fortresses were constructed along the frontier, at Tagajo, at Izuajo, at Akitajo, not as temporary camps, but as permanent military installations designed to hold a contested border. These are the physical remnants of a war that lasted longer than the entire lifespan of most modern nations. The Emishi General Atarui, who led the resistance in the final phase of the wars, was not a tribal chieftain of a scattered people. He commanded forces capable of tactical operations against professional imperial armies, conducted diplomacy with the court, and held the northeast for long enough that Tamuramaro, the most celebrated general of his age, chose to negotiate his surrender rather than continue fighting a war that was clearly not won. The court's decision to execute Atarui, despite Tamuramaro's recommendation, was not the resolution of a military conflict. It was the erasure of a political problem. The chronicles that record these events were written by the victors, revised by the victors, and organized around a framework that required the Emishi to be barbarians. Everything in the written record that describes the Emishi comes from sources with a direct interest in their dehumanization. Their own language, whatever it was, left no written record. Their own accounts of these events do not survive. What survives is the Yamato version. And yet certain things cannot be revised out of the record entirely. The fact that the wars lasted 2 centuries, the fact that the greatest general of the age asked for mercy for his captive and was overruled, the fact that the fortresses built to contain the Emishi were never torn down and never stopped being needed, the fact that the place names of northeastern Japan still carry sounds that do not derive from Japanese etymology, and that linguists have struggled to assign to any known language family ghostly traces of a tongue that the court erased, but the landscape remembered. The DNA now adds the final piece. The people the chronicles described as absorbed were never fully absorbed. The genetic signal of their presence, carried in the bodies of people living in the same valleys today, measures the degree to which the official story was always incomplete. The absorption was a story the court told. The Northeast was a territory the court controlled administratively. The people in it carried genes the court could not legislate away. There is a modern dimension to the Emishi story that the genomic research opens without fully resolving, and it runs through the Ainu, the indigenous people of Hokkaido, in a way that matters enormously for living communities. The Ainu have been officially recognized as indigenous people of Japan only since 2019. For most of the modern period, they were classified as a minority with ambiguous legal status, subjected to policies of forced assimilation throughout the Meiji era that included bans on their language, forced resettlement, and the confiscation of traditional lands. The Japanese government's 2019 recognition was a significant step, but came after more than a century of policies that had depleted Ainu communities and suppressed their cultural practices. The relationship between the Ainu and the Emishi is one of the most contested questions in Japanese historical genetics. Some researchers have argued that the Ainu are the direct descendants of the Emishi, who retreated northward as the Yamato conquest of Honshu progressed, eventually establishing themselves on Hokkaido. Others argue that the relationship is more complex, with the Ainu representing a distinct population that shares deep Jomon ancestry with the Emishi, but is not descended from them in any simple linear sense. What the ancient DNA record now shows is that the Jomon genetic component, which is the primary ancestral signature of the Ainu, was distributed across the entire Japanese archipelago before the Yayoi and Kofun migrations diluted it across most of the main islands. The Ainu in Hokkaido and the modern populations of northeastern Honshu, who carry the elevated Jomon and third component signals, are connected through shared ancestry that predates the Yamato state by thousands of years. Whether that connection runs through the Emishi specifically or through a broader pattern of Jomon population continuity in the northern archipelago is a question the genetics cannot fully resolve. What it can resolve is the claim that the Jomon people and their likely Emishi descendants disappeared. The Ainu are living proof that the claim was always false in Hokkaido. The genomic data from northeastern Honshu is now providing comparable evidence for the mainland. The suppression narrative requires a vanishing. The vanishing on the evidence now available never fully happened. The third ancestral component in modern Japanese genomes, the one the RIKEN study associated with northeastern Asia and potentially the Emishi, is not a small signal buried in statistical noise. It is a measurable population scale contribution that becomes more prominent as you move from western Japan, where the Yamato court was strongest, toward the northeast, where the Emishi held out longest. This geographic gradient is one of the most compelling features of the data. Population genetics regularly produces findings that require complex alternative explanations. Random drift, founder effects, bottlenecks, and unsampled ancient populations can all produce apparent signals that do not reflect the historical event the researcher is tempted to attribute them to. The skeptical questions are always worth asking. But a gradient that runs precisely along the historical axis of the Yamato frontier wars, that peaks in the Tohoku region and diminishes in direct proportion to distance from the area the chronicles describe as Emishi territory, is not easily explained by the alternatives. The gradient follows the history. The history follows the genome. What this means for the standard narrative of Japanese origins is that the two-chapter story, Jomon plus Yayoi, was always an oversimplification, and that the oversimplification was not innocent. The dual origins model had the effect of rendering the Emishi invisible at the population level, collapsing them into the Yayoi descending mainstream in a way that made the failure of their resistance look complete. The tripartite model restores their genetic presence to the story. It is a small correction in the language of population genetics. In the language of history, it is a significant one. The Neanderthal inheritance woven through modern Japanese genomes adds one more dimension to this story, and it is one that connects it to a much longer arc of human history. The Neanderthal-derived DNA that approximately 1 to 2% of the modern Japanese genome contains is not randomly distributed. Specific sequences have been identified in genes associated with immune response, with the metabolism of certain environmental substances, with neurological development, and in several studies published between 2020 and 2025, with differential risk profiles for a range of modern diseases. The COVID-19 Severity Association, identified in 2020, was perhaps the most widely publicized example, a Neanderthal-derived sequence on chromosome 3 that significantly elevated the risk of severe complications for people who carried it. These are not ancient curiosities. They are living biological consequences of interbreeding events that occurred 50 to 60,000 years ago. The Neanderthals who interbred with the ancestors of modern humans are extinct as a population, but their genes are not extinct. They are running in living bodies right now, influencing health outcomes, immune responses, and biological processes in ways that researchers are only beginning to map. For Japan specifically, the distribution of Neanderthal-derived sequences varies in ways that track the population history the rest of the genomic data describes. The Jomon-descended populations, including modern Ainu and the more Jomon-enriched communities of Okinawa and the Northeast, show a different Neanderthal inheritance profile from the Yayoi-descended Western Japanese populations. The differences are subtle but measurable, and they extend the story of Japan's complex ancestry back through tens of thousands of years of human movement across East Asia to the deepest available layer of the genomic record. The modern Japanese person walking through a city today is not a simple product of two migration waves. They are a palimpsest, Jomon hunters, who reached the archipelago at least 15,000 years ago and built a culture that lasted for 12 millennia. Yayoi and Kofun migrants from the mainland who brought rice farming and imperial political culture and progressively altered the genetic makeup of the population across the main islands. A third ancestral component from the northeast, carried most strongly in the regions where the Emishi held out against the court. And underneath all of it, the ancient inheritance from archaic humans who encountered the ancestors of East Asians tens of thousands of years before Japan existed as a concept. The genome carries all of it simultaneously. The official history chose to tell only part of the story. Return to the northeastern mountains, the place names that don't derive from Japanese, the valleys where the Emishi General Atarui organized resistance against the most powerful state in the archipelago for long enough that the court's greatest general asked for mercy and was refused. The fortresses that were never torn down because the frontier was never truly pacified, only reclassified. The people who live in those valleys today carry the third ancestral signal at its highest measured frequency in the modern Japanese population. They are the genomic record of everything the official history spent 12 centuries trying to make invisible. Their existence is not remarkable or unusual. They are simply living in the same places their ancestors lived, doing what populations do everywhere and always do. They survived. The DNA study published in May 2026 did not discover the Emishi. It confirmed what the population that descended from them had never stopped being. It gave a number to the survival and a geographic distribution to the persistence. It translated the place names that don't come from Japanese into a genomic language that the modern research infrastructure can read. The dual origins model of Japanese ancestry was always an oversimplification, and it was always, at least in part, a political one. A narrative shaped by the needs of a court that had spent centuries justifying the erasure of a people by insisting the erasure had worked. The tripartite model restores the complexity. It puts the third chapter back into a story that had been edited down to 2. For the Ainu, for the communities of northeastern Japan, for the broader understanding of how populations survive conquest through biology when they cannot survive it through politics, the finding matters in ways that extend beyond the journal article that announced it. The people the textbooks said vanished are in the data. They have been in the data since the first ancestral DNA studies began, waiting for a sample size large enough and a methodology precise enough to make the signal unmistakable. That sample size arrived. The methodology arrived. And the answer it returned is the answer that the landscape had been giving all along, in place names, in mountain villages, in communities that persisted in the Northeast long after the court stopped sending armies to subjugate them. They were never who the textbooks said they were. 2 peoples, 2 migrations. A clean origin story that fit the needs of a state that had been built on erasing a third. The genome does not erase. It only accumulates. And 12 centuries after the imperial court decided the Emishi story was over, the accumulated record of their survival is sitting inside the DNA of the people who live where they lived, undeniable, measurable, and permanently written into the biological record of a nation that is still, in the most literal sense, theirs. The only thing that ever vanished was the story the victors told about them. The people themselves never left.